Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Dennis.
All right.
Take it away.
As we've been working on all those reports, both the self-studies and the annual reports and everything, trying to think through all the things that we've learned about improving quality and all. One of the things I've come to realize is that we don't have much history down pat in terms of education. And this was an interesting study because just recently, well, it came out with it in 2016, but a book I just picked up by Julio Gonzalez, who you may be familiar with, who wrote those 2 volumes on church history. Brilliant church historian. Don't read him for theology, but read him for history. Right. He's really good on that. But he wrote a little book called The History of Theological Education. And what he set out to do is answer the question, when was it that we started deliberately training pastors? And right away, since I read the back of the book, I kept thinking, well, the early church must have been doing that. And do you know when it was? Anybody? When we specifically started training pastors. Any guesses? 1800s. Early 1800s. Up until then, the focus of all the training that was done was training the people in the church. How do we train new pastors in the early church? Come on, you all took church history. The bishops did that. They trained newer pastors. The bishops weren't ruling pastors, or ruling bishops. They were pastoral bishops. They were bishops over areas where they would train going forward. So it was only the 1800s. So theological education, as we know it, is really a brand new subject. And it is still being thought through. And as Glenn said, now that we're moving into the 2/3 world, the majority world, we're having to rethink Western education, rethinking a lot of what we're doing here to expand our knowledge. But we've got to be real careful we're not stuck in a 20th century mode of theological education. One of the hardest things I've ever learned how to do was educate educators. Because the way we normally think is within the confines of 4 walls. When COVID hit, there were professors who actually quit because they would not learn how to do anything on Zoom or those modes. They had to have it done in a classroom. And yet we know that 90% of what I say will be forgotten by a student, unless they're writing it down and other things that's done. Only 10% gets remembered. A lot of things along those lines. But one of the other things that comes up out of this is what we don't realize in what we would call late 20th century education, Christian education, seminary education in particular, is simply this. Up until the 1960s, there was no such thing as a Master of Divinity. You went through your 4 years of undergraduate training, and then you went to seminary, and you know what you got out of it?
Bachelor of Divinity.
A Bachelor of Divinity. The reason for that, it was people did not believe that a Bachelor of Divinity was worthy of really being a graduate level program. It's too practical. And then by the time you get into the 60s, people started thinking, well, you already did an undergraduate program. The best, at least we can give you is a master's on it. So keep in mind, a Master of Divinity, exactly how we've done it, used to be an undergraduate program. But what we don't understand about history that changed from 1960s to the 1970s is this. Up until the 1970s, the majority of students entering seminary were coming out of Bible college backgrounds. They already had their Bible knowledge. And because of that, seminary said, okay, what we're depending on is the Bible college is there to train you, to teach you the Bible. We'll come along and now train you in all the tools that you need. And so they threw you right into Greek, right into Hebrew, and all of that. When I started seminary in 1973, yes, I'm that old, In 1973, they said everything has now changed. For the first time, the majority of students were not coming from Bible college backgrounds. Now, if you looked at all of your students that you've got in your schools, what percent do you think are coming from Bible college backgrounds now? Yeah, almost nobody. And yet, theological education on a seminary level has not changed at all. You expect them to know everything about the Bible. And what are we getting from our churches? People who don't even know basic Bible. And yet we throw them into some of the courses that we do right away without even teaching them basics. So there's some of the history we've got. Now, let me start and deal with faculty. If you want to teach on a elementary school or a high school level, you have to have very, very specialized courses in writing tests, tests and measurements and all of that, how to write objectives and all. If you want to teach on a tertiary level, what do you have to have? Just a piece of paper that hangs on the wall that says, yeah, I know the subject. You may be the world's worst communicator, world's worst person in putting together a decent test. But as long as you have that piece of paper on the wall, you can be hired. We've never been trained as seminary professors how to write objectives. And therefore, this is the problem that we have as an organization in helping you to write organizational objectives, program objectives for your classes. Because we've never been trained to do that. I went back and took courses on all this so I could figure out how to do it. And then I started, while we were in South Africa, training faculties of universities even, that they would invite me into to do that. Therefore, writing objectives is really, really critical. But, and I like your idea, Hoffman, about putting some videos together on this. I think we need to work on doing that. Because writing objectives is so critical. But one of the mistakes I think we make in doing the overall institutional objectives is we start from the beginning. That's the mistake. When you're writing those types of objectives, you've got to start with your end product. When our students finish that 3-year program, what do you want them to know? What do you want them to be? Those things about behaviors, ethics, all the things that are about personal ends of things. And what do you want them to do? We're excellent at writing objectives on the things of what we want them to learn. But how do you write effective objectives? Those are the more subjective things. And not only do you have to write them, but how do you then evaluate those? How are you going to evaluate whether somebody really has grown in their faith over 3 years? That's very subjective, but there are ways of doing that. And almost all of your program objectives that you've got say that you train people in personal piety. And the third area in what you want them to do as a result of having been to seminary. And preaching is usually the one thing we all do. But what is it they should be able to do when they get there? So when we come in, we wind up finding, okay, you've got all these program objectives that talk about what they need to learn. But we don't do much in those other 2 areas, and that's where we suffer the most. And that's where we find the biggest problems in going into schools and doing the evaluations. Because unless you've got those program evaluations down on all 3 levels, what do you want them to know, be, and do when they graduate? And then what you do, you work backwards from that. How are we going to get all of our courses together in our curriculum so they will meet those objectives when we get there? Because most seminaries will start from the beginning. Well, we need to have an Old Testament survey or introduction, New Testament introduction, and work from there. That may not get you to the objectives that you want. You've got to start from the end product, what your product is going to look like graduating, and work back from there. Especially when you look at the statistics on like Greek and Hebrew. If 90% of those who graduate from our traditional seminaries never keep up with their Greek and Hebrew, when are we going to ask the question, why not? There was one scholar, and I can never remember his name, Ward was his last name. He taught in many different countries around the world and then finished teaching up at TEDS in Chicago. And he, for years, tried to get seminaries to think on two different levels about teaching languages. One was for those who really had a great acclimation in languages, to give them the type of education we do in Greek and Hebrew. But for the 80 to 90% of those pastors who are never going to keep up with it, is there not a better way of doing that they're going to continue working with the language? Now, we've come up with a foolproof method of doing that, but we're not going to tell you what it is, unless you ask us or pay us. But there are ways of doing it, especially because we don't teach Greek and Hebrew like any other language is ever taught. Do you learn Spanish the way we teach Greek and Hebrew? No, because we teach it in such a foreign way, it remains a foreign language. We've got to think of better ways of doing it if you're going to reach that end product of that pastor who's going to continue to use the language in a way that's going to benefit what they're going to do for their church. I think those are some of the biggest things we're up against, because we can then go from writing those program objectives to writing your objectives for every one of your courses. And Adam can tell you, because we work back and forth, and Hoffman, I go through all the syllabi that they have produced over the years, and I have final say over them until now. Because we don't know how to write these objectives. Because one of the things about objectives is they must be measurable. If they are not measurable, you have not accomplished meeting your objective. And what we see in so many cases is you've got these nice objectives, and it's not linked to anything. We look at your objectives, and say, okay, those objectives are good, but how are they? What you've got to do, and what I've tried to get all of our faculty to do, is write your objective, and then put one more line in there. Students will prove they have met this objective by. What are they going to do to actually prove they've met that objective? Otherwise, your objectives are meaningless. And if you can do that much, you'll improve so much of what you're doing. Any questions on that part? My church history, any good?
I have a question.
Sure.
Something I've been wrestling with related to the problem of incoming seminarians, their biblical literacy is significantly lower than it used to be for the reasons you mentioned. Yet the lofty goals that we want by the time they graduate seminary, the gap is wider. And so the question I've been wondering is how much of a burden can a MDiv program honestly carry, given these circumstances? Like going, A is now way back here, B hasn't changed the destination. So in terms of our expectations and model, so a 90 credit degree, for example, used to take some, A was here and B was here. Now A is way back here.
Yeah.
But we still have a 90, 3-year, 90, whatever. So that's kind of the question I've been wrestling with. Are there better ways to do it? Or are expectations too lofty, idealistic, or do you work back on the back end prior to seminary so that there are, now you get, 20 years from now we get students that, no, they're coming into the seminaries that have a much higher biblical literacy. Is that the real problem we need to address? So,
Well,
I don't know, those are just kind of.
Well, it's both that have to be addressed. How do we get the churches really to do a better job than what they're doing? And to do that, we've got to train the pastors to know how to do that better. But you're asking the right question, because that goes right to what Glenn was talking about before. We've got to move to these, what was the term you used for? Competency-based education. One of the examples I give on this is, again, going back to history, what was expected of a student before they got to seminary, when they were going to Bible college, they would take Bible survey. They would learn the content of the Bible. Then we would put them in Bible into Old and New Testament introduction, where we got into all this stuff on background of all the different debates on who the authors were and all those things. It's interesting, in all the years I've been in all the churches I have, I've never had a discussion with anybody about authorship of books of the Bible and all the debates on it, or the JEDP theory. Never taught it, never had anything to do with it except on a seminary level. Why are we still doing it? Especially when our people don't know the Bible to begin with. And so we've got to ask ourselves some very real questions and very hard questions, because we want seminary education to remain way up here for our pastors. But what are we teaching them that's making them competent to teach that same stuff at church? I remember one time in seminary, my mentor who went to Faith Seminary, I asked him a question. I said, what are we supposed to do with all this heavy stuff that you're giving us in seminary here? And he looked at me and goes, Mr. Bennett, everything you learn here, you teach in your churches. Well, that was nice in theory, but we don't generally do that. But we spend all, that's why I think this concept of two streams of theological education is an important thing to look at. Those who are going to be the scholars need to be getting stuff that's really the heavy stuff that they're going to work through for us. The pastors aren't getting involved with that. They're not on that same level when they get out there and work with real people. We've got some struggles to think through in terms of theological education, including how we evaluate all of that.
Well, again, that's going to go back to what you were saying earlier. You teach pastors how to preach and do Greek and Hebrew. You're not teaching them how to teach. You're not teaching them how to counsel. You're not teaching them how to
Right.
really be shepherds
Right.
and be pastors.
Yeah.
So I can't do something I don't know how to do.
Yeah, exactly. A couple of students told me, the first thing that happened when they get out of seminary is they got in their first church, and they had 2 funerals they had to do. They were never taught how to do a funeral.
That's one of Dr. Barker's favorite, was one of his favorite stories, was that the student came to Dr. Barker and said, can you help me through this funeral? He said, well, you learned this, this, and this. He said, but these people were really dead.
Yeah. And see, one of my hopes for arts is that after we get through CHIA and get that taken care of, is we can take some of these annual meetings like this and really talk through this type of thing together and try to figure out better ways of what we're doing without worrying, well, we're just bringing down the level of seminary education. Well, what does that mean? Especially, you look at the people you're training in the 2/3 world with even less background than what many of our people have. Are we supposed to dump all of this really heavy stuff on them all of a sudden? We've got to struggle through that. Dan?
Yeah, I think that's why some of what Glenn was saying about the affective and the psychomotor, those are the other two categories, objectives are really important, because we're not saying we're bringing the standard down.
Right.
But what we are saying is that there's a lot more that goes into what makes an effective pastor, an effective person in ministry for the long haul. And it isn't, you have this body of knowledge and that's it. Yeah. It's the kind of person that comes out. So I would much rather see somebody that comes out maybe with a smaller sort of body of knowledge and yet a passion for learning for the rest of their lives, knowing how to continue to learn.
Yeah.
Somebody who comes out knowing, I need a mentor for the rest of my life, and I know how to get good mentor for the rest of my life. And those are things I think we can measure and actually say, hey, we're actually upping the standard for what we're requiring. We're not bringing it down. Anyway.
Yeah.
So.
Well, especially when you realize that statistics that have come out from like the Pew Foundation and everything have said that 90% of the pastors who leave the pastorate leave because of personal problems, not because of theological problems. And with that being the case, one of my best examples of this, am I overtime now?
Yeah.
I am. All right, I'll quit with this.
You're saying good stuff.
I'll quit with this example. We had a pastor in our denomination who, back in the 90s, was pastoring this one church in mid-America. I won't give you his name because you'd recognize it, his family name. But a single pastor, his church was growing like crazy in an inner city. And every Thursday night, the pastor would get together with the elders to plan the Sunday service. Well, one Thursday night, they came to his apartment and found him laying on the couch with a plastic bag over his head. He had committed suicide. And he left this note saying, all of my life I have struggled with the feelings of same-sex attraction. I've never given into it. I hated every thought of it and everything, but I never felt comfortable sharing this with anyone. And when I read that, and I knew him because I had been in his church before, when I read that, my first thought was, that's an indictment on us as a denomination, that he could not even go to another pastor in our denomination without fear of being taken to presbytery over the whole thing, and wound up committing suicide instead. That's where the affective comes in, teaching people by mentoring them, and what that means. I had when I was addressing our presbytery one time, we had the largest presbytery in the PCA, and I said to there was 77 pastors there, I said, how many of you have ever been mentored? Less than 40% of them had ever been mentored. How do we expect those pastors to mentor their children, their flock, when they've never been mentored by anybody? See, that's why I say we've got to rethink education by way of what are we trying to produce? What should they know? What should they really be able to do when they get out there? Can they run a business meeting at church? You know, what is it they've got to do? What are they going to do as soon as they get out? They've got to accomplish a lot of things that we're not preparing them for. Now, there's no way we can prepare them for everything. You know, that's the one problem seminaries have always admitted to. There's a book by James White, What I Never Learned at Seminary. One of the best books I've read because he's got like 36 different things in there. So seminary never taught me. And then he really takes you through a lot of really great stuff in his book. We give that book a lot of times to our graduates because we say, we didn't do all of it. No, here. Right?
I was just going to say, I mean, that's the important aspect of recognizing the place of the church in these things, that it is really the church's role of mentoring and the pastors, right? And the importance. That's one of the encouraging things about our seminaries particularly is having that tight bond between the church and the seminary and recognizing the importance of that.
Which is Titus 2, really, is the whole mentoring process.
That's right.
Any other questions or anything, or comments? No? Back to you.
This still live? Okay. I just happened to see this in the rack out there, this 2023 Student Survey Review. It's in the rack back out there, and this is a wonderful, piece, and this really should be mentioned, on your website here. So, if they only have a few copies, but I'm sure that if you want one, you can have one.
We have one.
They have more. Okay.